So first off, it's always a delight to welcome our previous Wonderland Award winners back to the conference and to USC. The winner of note is Cadagin, who recently completed his doctorate at Stanford in musicology, and excerpts from his dissertation is what won the 2019 USC Libraries Wonderland Award. So today, Joe is going to talk about the lineage of opera's long-harbored infatuation with insanity, beginning with the mad scenes of the 19th century and continuing into 20th century surrealist dream sequences, continuing our involvement with surrealism today. So please welcome Joe Cadagin to continue this afternoon's program. Take it away, Joe.
All right, and just as Mark suggested, the best way to, I think, to line it up would be if you move your cursor, and in the upper right-hand corner, it's the view icon, and then click side-by-side view to put my face next to the oh, and the other thing I wanted to mention is headphones are recommended since I'm showing a lot of musical examples. When Ophelia enters in Act 4 of Hamlet, driven mad by the prince's cruelty, it's the deranged girl's singing that immediately alerts us to her distracted state. Unable to communicate coherently, she falls back on the stereotyped emotional language of broadsheet ballads with bawdy lyrics. Such a display of indiscretion could only be attributed to madness, as women of her station in Shakespeare's time would never have performed publicly in this manner. But the fractured nature of her medley will also clue in a modern-day audience. She flits from one song to the next, interjecting occasionally with spoken non sequiturs. This kind of musical raving became a standard marker of mental illness in Western art. The madmen who populate Carroll's Wonderland are Victorian extensions of the trope. They never fail to sing or recite for Alice, often breaking off mid-song like Ophelia. Moreover, their perversions of nursery rhymes simulate the irrational speech of the deranged, especially when their parodies produce impossible or self-contradictory images. In the Mad Hatter's alteration to Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, an inexplicable metaphor comparing a bat to a tea tray in the sky confirms that the character, as his name implies, is not in his right mind. In operatic adaptations of Alice, however, where we expect characters to burst out into song, we're less apt to read spontaneous music making as a sign of madness. Carroll's letters indicate that, in the case of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Bat, he expected composers would simply employ the familiar tune attached to the original rhyme. But in practice, composers have typically taken a cue from the author's textual parody and formulated analogous musical parodies, slightly altering the melody's contours and rhythms to convey the Hatter's madness. Alice's remark, "I've heard something like it," therefore refers not only to the bastardized text, but the twisted tune as well. Korean composer Unsuk Chin takes this route in her Alice in Wonderland opera, which premiered in Munich in 2007, with major revival productions in St. Louis in 2012 and Los Angeles and London in 2015. In this example, I show Chin's melodic departure above the original. Notably, she extends the opening ascent so that it reaches up to a B flat, placing us in the Mixolydian mode rather than C major. Notice too the descending chromatic line in the last two measures, where Chin and her co-librettist, American playwright David Henry Hwang, have taken the liberty of changing Carroll's tea tray to ashtray, which is a bit more plausible as a metaphor. But don't worry if these musical terms are unfamiliar to you. You'll no doubt pick up on the melodic alterations in this audio excerpt, and you'll also hear a portion of Chin's subsequent variations on the tune and text. It becomes a sparkling trio for Alice and her mad tea party companions, who riff on a series of words that resemble twinkle. You can't hear the examples. Are the examples audible?
No.
Hello?
Sorry, Joe.
No, we can't hear them.
Oh, god dang it. I thought we did the,
Can't hear.
I thought we did the thing to make sure this wouldn't happen.
Joe, go to on your share screen and go to advanced sharing options.
Yep, I found it now. That was my fault. Not your fault. My apologies. Let me start that example again.
Okay, then you can get rid of the microphone. X the microphone.
At the great concert given by the
Is that audible?
Yes.
Okay.
Queen, at the great concert given by the Queen of Hearts, where I sang Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Bat, how I wonder what you're at. You know this song, perhaps?
I've heard something like it.
Up above the world you fly, like an ashtray in the sky.
Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. Twinkle, sprinkle, little stew, how I wonder what you are. Twinkle, sprinkle, twinkle, twinkle, little star. Twinkle, sprinkle, twinkle, sprinkle, sprinkle, twinkle.
At the
This portrayal of madness through musical quotation, distortion, and fragmentation is representative of Chin's Mad Tea Party scene, the strongest episode in her eccentric operatic treatment of Alice. But before we delve into this scene any further, it would be helpful to understand its historical origins and the cultural baggage it carries. Along with themes of love, death, and suicide, opera has traditionally been obsessed with madness. In the first decades of the 19th century, depictions of mentally ill characters became standardized into mad scenes, which are almost exclusively assigned to the prima donna. Driven to an emotional breaking point by, say, a lover's betrayal, her character is unable to handle the reality of a trauma. A chorus of onlookers expresses a mixture of horror and pity as they observe the leading lady's erratic behavior, consistent with medical symptoms of psychosis, including hallucinations, delusions, thought disorder, and incoherent speech. We, as contemporary audiences, take it for granted that an opera score is constructed from a palette of musical themes attached to characters, situations, or abstract ideas. The composer sets up these symbolic associations early in the opera, and then calls on these sonic calling cards at appropriate dramatic junctures. But before Richard Wagner formalized a complex system of leitmotifs to organize his massive music dramas, such reprises of thematic material were actually relatively rare in the repertoire. Up to the end of the 18th century, an opera consisted of several self-contained arias and ensembles that were motivically unrelated to one another. It wasn't until around the beginning of the 19th century that composers began to experiment with the dramatic potential of thematic reiteration, including the possibility of exploiting these reprises to sonically convey a character's madness. We can see this in the archetypical mad scene from Gaetano Donizetti's 1835 Lucia di Lammermoor, based on a novel by Walter Scott. It's a standard Romeo and Juliet scenario relocated to Scotland. The titular Lucia and her lover Edgardo belong to feuding families. Lucia is forced to wed another man, and Edgardo crashes the ceremony to curse Lucia, accusing her of infidelity. The shock of this ordeal pushes her over the edge, and she stabs her groom to death when he's preparing for the nuptial bed. The deranged Lucia, still in her blood-stained wedding dress, interrupts the guests' dancing. Donizetti sets her psychotic rant as a 20-minute vocal tour de force, a virtuosic display of bel canto runs, high notes, and abrupt changes in affect as her thoughts wander and she experiences a series of hallucinations. As she makes her entrance, Lucia imagines herself reunited with her lover Edgardo at their fountain tryst from Act 1 and addresses him tenderly. In this hallucinatory moment, we hear the flute play a snippet of the couple's love duet. But this sweet memory is cut short by shuddering tremolo strings and stabbing winds as Lucia witnesses a delirious vision of the ghost said to inhabit the ruins of the Act 1 fountain. So in this video example, I'll play the snippet of the love duet from Act 1 so you can hear their love theme, and then you'll see a snippet from the mad scene where the flute reprises this theme. After this nightmare departs, Lucia goes on to hallucinate a hypothetical wedding, the wedding she would have preferred to Edgardo, and hears the celestial harmony of a nuptial hymn. The orchestra plays a more lyrical variation on the foreboding processional melody that accompanied Lucia when she reluctantly entered for her forced marriage in the previous act. And again, first you'll hear the wedding processional from the previous act, and then you'll hear the idealized version of this wedding processional that she is hallucinating. There's no doubt an exploitative element to the way a mad scene theatricalizes mental illness and reinforces outdated notions of feminine hysteria. And when I use the words madness, insanity, you should hear them with quotation marks, just like Diane Wagner said yesterday about the photographs of mentally ill patients, that these are essentializing terms and the language of a bygone era. At the same time, by virtue of its status as a musical art form, opera grants us sonic access to the mind of the character. While we as an audience cannot see what Lucia sees, we are at least privy to her sonic hallucinations. We hear the same assemblage of fragmented and distorted musical memories that run through her head, allowing us to recognize the roots of her psychotic responses and sympathize with her affliction. Such reminiscence motives, which afford a kind of musical form of psychoanalytic logic for the listener, became a key feature of the mad scene. We also find a rather forward-looking variation on this technique in Donizetti's opera Anabolena, which premiered 5 years before his Lucia. Here, Donizetti experiments with quoting a musical theme from outside his score, one by another composer. As she awaits her execution in prison, Anne Boleyn hallucinates a meeting with her former fiancé, Percy, whom she begs, "Guide me to the sweet mansion of my birth." Taking a cue from this line, Donizetti sets a later portion of her mad scene to the tune of the popular American parlor ballad, Home Sweet Home, which you'll hear here. With this novel bit of outside quotation, Donizetti anticipated the direction that mad scenes would take 100 years later, as we'll see in a moment. Curiously, the gender dynamic reverses around the turn of the century, with madness and dreams becoming the domain of predominantly male operatic characters. Psychotic episodes are no longer confined to isolated arias, but last full acts or even entire operas. Furthermore, 20th century composers and librettists eliminate the framing chorus of onlookers that anchored us in reality in 19th century opera. Much as in Carroll's dream literature, both Alice and especially Sylvie and Bruno, the crossover from the waking world into the delirious dream world is rendered imperceptible in Austrian composer Erich Korngold's opera Die Tote Stadt from 1920. In Bruges, the dead city of Korngold's title, the widower Paul mourns the death of his wife, Marie. One day, he encounters a young dancer, Marietta, who is Marie's splitting image. He invites her to his apartment, but Marietta is repulsed when Paul attempts to dress her up like the portrait of his dead wife. The act that follows, in which Paul secretly observes the antics of Marietta and her theater friends, has an uncanny quality that's best represented in the scene I'm about to show. Marietta, who is the prima ballerina at the Bruges Opera, suggests an impromptu rehearsal on the street. The company is currently performing Giacomo Meyerbeer's opera Robert le Diable, which features the spooky Dance of the Resurrected Nuns, famously depicted here by Degas on the right. As Marietta sets up the blocking for this ballet on the street, a procession of real-life sisters happens to enter. Korngold produces a strange collage-like effect by superimposing 3 musical layers in conflicting keys. The living nuns' processional music as one layer, the tolling of bells as the second, and an offstage fanfare on trumpet and clarinet that announces the troupe's spontaneous performance. Covered in a shroud as the dead abbess, Marietta rises zombie-like when her companion whistles Meyerbeer's resurrection motive from Robert le Diable, the motive that brings the nuns to life in this earlier opera. We have here then an unusual instance of an opera within an opera, or more accurately, a dream sequence from an older 1831 opera that Korngold has transplanted into his own 1920 opera. So first you'll hear a snippet of the resurrection motive from Robert le Diable, and then it'll transition into Die Tote Stadt, and don't worry, you won't miss the resurrection motive. There's a little title there to show you when it comes. As you might have guessed, the strange atmosphere evoked by the music is an indication that we're witnessing the dream of a man racked by obsessive grief. At the violent climax, Paul strangles Marietta to death, only to awaken in his apartment. Reflecting on this nightmare, he finally attains closure and resolves to move on with his life. In later repertoire, however, we no longer have this kind of safe retransition to reality. The 1932 opera Julieta by Czech composer Bohuslav Martinu is set entirely in the dream of its lead character. Michel, a traveling bookseller, pursues the titular Julieta, a mysterious beauty who lives in a seaside village where everyone has lost their memory. The final act takes place in the Central Bureau of Dreams, where an official warns Michel that he should awaken and return to the real world, or else descend into madness. Enticed by Julieta's offstage voice, he stays behind in the dream and is trapped forever in the village of amnesiacs, implying that his waking self has succumbed to insanity. While Martinu doesn't quote any existing tunes, a recurring waltz played by an onstage accordionist has the same uncanny cut and pasted quality as Korngold's sonic collage in Die Tote Stadt. Here's that accordion. I would turn the volume up a little, it's quite soft. The staging of dreams as a space for working out one's neuroses, in the case of Die Tote Stadt, or completely surrendering to them, in the case of Julieta, will no doubt conjure the name of Sigmund Freud, whose psychoanalytic theories were becoming more widely known in the 1920s and 30s, thanks in part to his influence on the surrealists. In fact, Georges Neveu, who penned the 1927 drama that inspired Martinu's Julieta, and this is Neveu here, he was briefly involved with the Paris Surrealist group around the time he wrote the play. While Korngold's Die Tote Stadt predates Surrealism by a few years, the opera obviously anticipates the movement in the way it probes the subconscious. The Surrealists, as we've heard quite a bit from Mark, the Surrealists sought an art that would be driven by what their founder, poet André Breton, on the left, what he termed pure psychic automatism. The techniques they developed or adapted from Freud, dream analysis, automatic writing and drawing, free association, operations dictated by chance or whim, were intended to tap into one's subconscious, liberating the artist from the restraints of bourgeois morality and taste. The impossible images these techniques conjured, erotic, violent, and taboo in nature, often resembled the ravings and hallucinations of the mentally ill. From the beginning, the Surrealists revered the work of schizophrenic outsider artists, whom they sought to emulate. But that's not to say that Surrealists viewed insanity as an ideal mental state. The games and techniques they employed were only supposed to simulate madness, without placing one in danger of completely losing a grip on reality. In this respect, the Surrealist modus operandi is close to Carroll's use of nonsense logic in Wonderland, in that it generates the impression of insanity through structured, formalized methods. It's no surprise then that Carroll is listed among the movement's forerunners in Breton's Abridged Dictionary of Surrealism, and that several Surrealist artists found inspiration in Carroll's tales of dreamers and madmen. In the toolbox of Surrealist procedures, collage techniques became a particularly potent vehicle for visual artists to create hallucinatory images. Max Ernst, who produced a fantastic series of collage novels in the 1920s and 30s, defined the technique as, quote, the systematic exploitation of the fortuitous or engineered encounter of two or more intrinsically incompatible realities on a surface which is manifestly inappropriate for the purpose, and the spark of poetry which leaps across the gap as these two realities are brought together. Ernst would go on to create his own enigmatic lithographs to illustrate a German translation of the Mad Tea Party chapter, but his earlier collage novels, pieced together from old Victorian engravings, which you can see examples of here, feel closer in spirit to Tenniel's Alice illustrations. In Unsuk Chin's Alice, we see the convergence of these two artistic trajectories. I'll remind you, Unsuk Chin is the composer of the 2007 Alice that we're returning to now. So we see the convergence of these two artistic trajectories I've laid out here. The stylistic illusions and distorted bits of familiar tunes that make up the Mad Tea Party scene look back to the sonic hallucinations of the 19th century mad scene and its 20th century offshoots. At the same time, by translating the Hatter and Hare's madness into a fractured series of disparate musical styles, Chin emulates the jarring juxtapositions of surrealist collage. In place of visual images, we're presented with a string of sonic images, each with its own historical and cultural associations. We as listeners are forced to draw a connection between incongruous musical fragments placed in proximity to one another. Such mental gymnastics transcend our everyday rational thought and allow us to experience the world on a higher plane of reality, a surreality we would otherwise experience only in dreams or in madness. Serving as an elegant microcosm, or a microcollage rather, of the scene as a whole is Chin's setting of the answers that the March Hare and Alice come up for the Hatter's Raven and Writing Desk riddle, which is itself a proto-surrealist instance of poetic collage. Astute viewers will recognize that Chin has lifted 5 of her 6 hypothetical answers from a footnote to Martin Gardner's The Annotated Alice. In this chart on the right here, I include the musical style Chin uses to set the individual answers. There are no direct quotations of existing music, at least none that I've pinpointed yet. Rather, Chin produces believable pastiches of Baroque music in answers 1 and 6, which resemble works by Bach and Vivaldi. Answers 2 and 5 are less allusions than colorful orchestral textures. For answer 2, a jangly metallic pulsing. For answer 5, a succession of staccato pitches, each played by a different soloist or subgroup of instruments to produce an effect rather like the chain reaction of a Rube Goldberg machine. Answer 3 is the only instance where we find a logical connection between the text of the solution and the music of Chin's score. Whenever a musical pitch is generated, it consists of a fundamental tone, which is the tone we hear, and a series of largely inaudible overtones that blend together to form the distinct timbre of an instrument or a voice. Playing on the groan-inducing answer that both A Raven and A Writing Desk begin with the letter A, Chin has the orchestra play the natural series of overtones on the pitch A, a musical pun that's only obvious to someone reading the score. Finally, the chords in answer 4 you may recognize as the familiar Amen cadence that concludes the singing of a hymn. This likely has some autobiographical significance. Chin's father was a Presbyterian minister, and she used to accompany church services on the piano as a little girl growing up in South Korea. And while I have a chance to cram in some biographical information on Chin here, I'll also mention before I play this example that she emigrated to Germany in 1988, where she studied with Hungarian composer and fellow carol enthusiast George Ligeti. But her introduction to Alice came as an adult rather than as a child, when she read Gödel Escher Bach by Douglas Hofstadter, who illustrates mathematical concepts using Jabberwocky and Carol's logic writing. So now we can hear this microcollage, and I would actually suggest that you follow along with the chart rather than the score up here.
Have you guessed yet? Why is a raven like a writing desk?
What is good for written books and the other for writing notes?
No!
Because a writing desk is a decimal thing and a raven is a decimal lens.
No!
Because both big give up? What is the answer?
I haven't the slightest idea.
Nor I.
At the end of each answer, the accompaniment either disintegrates or is prematurely cut off by the dormouse's snoring and other percussive interruptions. It's almost as if we're hearing the ripped edges of the musical scraps that make up this collage. We experience a sense of surrealist shock in the way Chin immediately transitions from a solemn amen cadence to the cartoonishly grotesque squeaks and honks of the Rube Goldberg passage, a juxtaposition that elicits the same comically subversive effect as Max Ernst's Virgin spanking the Christ child. The mock religious tone returns later in the scene when the Hatter explains to Alice that, guilty of murdering time during a performance of Twinkle Twinkle Little Bat, he has condemned his companions to an eternal 6 o'clock limbo of tea and scones. Chin and her co-librettist, David Henry Huang, insert a new number for the Hatter here. It's a self-flagellating mea culpa, a parody of the Confiteor you might hear chanted in the Latin Mass. The Hatter confesses his sins and begs forgiveness from the godlike figure of time, reciting a litany scattered with temporal and horological puns.
Oh, time, oh, time, I beg for mercy, shed tears of repentance, raining down upon thy holy hands. Flog my sinews, justify favor, in thine springs and dies. Time,
This religious pastiche, another musical scrap in Chin's polystylistic collage, has embedded within it an exceedingly clever quotation that will bring our overview of the mad scene full circle. Supporting the orchestral tick-tocking and that swoops in and out of the accompaniment is a deep, steady tolling played by the low brass, punctuated by the chiming of tubular bells and anvil. It's an unmistakable reference to the bells that herald the titular Tsar's coronation in Modest Mussorgsky's opera Boris Godanov from 1874. The opera, based on a Pushkin play, explores rumors surrounding the real-life 16th century Russian ruler, who was said to have arranged the murder of the rightful boy heir. Years later, in his Kremlin apartments, Boris receives news that someone claiming to be the slain Tsarevich is mustering a rebellion. The possibility that his plot failed unnerves the Tsar. He hallucinates a vision of the bloody child and desperately tries to convince the apparition of his innocence. In a bit of thematic reiteration that recalls Lucia de Lammermoor, the whirring and chiming of the room's mechanical clock are transformed in Boris's mind into the tolling of the coronation bells from earlier in the opera. They're a sonic reminder of the illegitimacy of his reign and the crime he committed to seize the crown. And again, you'll hear the coronation bells from the prologue of the opera, and then a snippet from the mad scene where this theme reprises.
Тебе пятно единое случайно завелось, душа сгорит, нальется сердце ядом, так тяжко станет, О молодом стучит в ушах укором и проклятием, и душит что-то, душит, и голова кружится, глаза дитя окровавленное. Вот так. Что это? Да, в углу. Колышется, растял, близится, дрожит и стонет. Чур, чур. Не я твой лиходей. Чур, чур, дитя.
And the full film of that opera with subtitles is on YouTube. It's one of my favorites. Like Boris, the Mad Hatter harbors a paranoid guilt that is set off by the ticking and chiming of clocks. Of course, unlike the Tsar's gory usurpation, the Mad Hatter's homicide is simply a literal interpretation of the musical expression murdering the time, that is, mangling the song's meter, its time signature. By running with the ridiculous scenario implied by Carol's pun, Chin sets up a humorous dramatic parallel with Boris Godanov that affords an opportunity to make an ironic musical connection to the mad scene tradition in which her opera participates. That very act of quotation is not only a nod to an iconic example of this trope, but it's also an extension of its historical conventions, as we've seen, the distorted reminiscence motives and allusions to pre-existing music that emerged as standard indicators of insanity. But is Chin simply rehashing antiquated and exploitative modes of depicting mental illness? That's a complex question that I hope to work through as I continue my research on this opera. One way to approach it is to consider how, by adapting Carol's novel, Chin and Huang actually subvert the mad scene convention by inverting it. That's to say, while in 19th century opera, the madwoman is placed in the midst of a chorus of sane bystanders, Alice is the sole character in her right mind, surrounded by a cast of madmen. And while the women of Korngold's Die Tote Stadt and Martineau's Julieta remain elusive objects of desire that the male characters obsessively seek in their dreams, Alice maintains her autonomy as the subject of her own dream. With her triumphant exclamation, "You're nothing but a pack of cards," she reasserts her humanity and reduces the hostile chimeras of Wonderland to mere playthings. That climactic moment is, I think, the key to understanding the nature of madness in both the opera and perhaps in the original novel. For it isn't literal mental illness we're dealing with, but something that actually threatens to overtake Alice and erase her identity. As I pointed out, there's a method to Carol's so-called madness. Jean-Jacques Le Cercle writes in his Philosophy of Nonsense, "This is the literary representation of madness, not madness itself. It is generated by semantic rules." More accurately, it's Carol's overextension or literalization of linguistic logic that simulates authentic insanity. That it seems disorderly, writes Patricia Meyer-Spacks, is a condemnation of the ordinary sloppy thinking of the reader and the sloppy traditions of his language. Indeed, at certain points during the Mad Tea Party scene, we're given hints that the Dormouse, Hatter, and Hare are only feigning their north-northwest madness, and that, in fact, they know a hawk from a handsaw, or more accurately, a raven from a writing desk. I'm thinking specifically of the passage in which they correct Alice's sloppy logic when she absent-mindedly remarks that "I say what I mean" and "I mean what I say" are semantically interchangeable. The madmen's list of counterexamples, though ludicrous, betray that their thinking is hyper-rational rather than irrational. In her setting, Chin produces a musical equivalent by attaching specific pitches to each word in the original statement. When the word order changes, the corresponding pitches are also rearranged accordingly. The transformation in meaning therefore has a sonic counterpart in the melodic anagrams. Alice joins in with their ensemble, trying out some of the semantic switcheroos herself.
I like what I get.
I get what I like.
I kill what I love.
It's the same thing as I love what I get.
I argue then that we can reconceive madness as the hyper-rationality of nonsense logic. Though the main source of amusement in Carol, nonsense also has a dangerous corrupting quality. It's a rigid mode of thinking that the antagonistic characters weaponize against the heroine. Indeed, Alice's very existence is repeatedly threatened by their ostensibly harmless puns and paradoxes, notably the Which Dreamed It conundrum from Looking Glass, where Tweedledum and Tweedledee suggest to Alice that she's simply a vision in the Red King's dream, destined to go out like a candle when he awakens. In Chin and Huang's operatic adaptation, Alice continuously risks succumbing to this form of logic herself. We have seen how, where Carol's heroine dismisses the Hatter and Harris shenanigans, her operatic counterpart actually partakes in their riddles and games. Their musical personality even begins to permeate Alice's vocal line. Like them, she starts to sing in distorted nursery songs and fractured scraps of outmoded operatic styles. Although Chin adopts the conventions of the mad scene, the very contagiousness of madness and its musical markers offer another indication that this isn't literal mental illness. Rather, there's something deeper at play here. We might reconceive nonsense logic, which masquerades as madness, in metaphorical terms. Its oppressiveness and infectiousness in Chin's opera suggests that it acts like some seductive ideology, a rigid, prescribed mode of thought to be passively adopted as an easier alternative to independent thought. Chin and Huang set up this reading themselves with the dream prologue and epilogue that they substitute for the two waking scenes of Alice on the riverbank with her sister. In the prologue, Alice encounters a little boy and a pair of old men who submit to their respective fates that they've been dealt. The little boy continues to drag a heavy mummified cat, and the men allow themselves to be shut away forever in the chamber where they're playing chess. I've avoided showing pictures from the 2007 Munich production by Achim Freyer, which would have distracted, as you can see from the musical examples. But you can see that here his doll-like masks and phallically Freudian noses complement the surrealist spirit of this scene. In the epilogue that follows Alice's nothing but a pack of cards outburst, she's instructed by an invisible man to grow her own flowers, that is, to take fate into her own hands and cultivate the garden of her life. As in Martineau's Julieta, we remain entirely confined to the dream world. But unlike the bookseller Michel, who prefers his visions to the waking world and surrenders to madness rather than face reality, Chin's Alice resists the temptation of yielding to external forces. Her simple horticultural act of nonconformity in the opera's epilogue teases out of this deceptively naive tale a latent allegory of self-determination and free thinking that the surrealists also read into Alice. To conclude, I'll leave you with the entry for Carol in the abridged Dictionary of Surrealism from 1938. In an era when all thought was considered so shocking that it would hesitate to form, what had become of human freedom? It resided entirely in the delicate hands of Alice. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joe. Just a reminder, folks, we will have Q&A after our next presenters. So to keep us on schedule, I would like to go ahead and introduce those folks.